A Turkish ship has docked at Somalia's coast. Its mission, as described, is to find oil and gas. But observers say Turkey's motives are much bigger. Somalia is not an oil-producing nation, but seismic studies have pointed to considerable oil and gas resources in its maritime territory. The Turkish vessel is all set to find these crucial resources. Turkey is already involved in various sectors in Somalia, but
an oil boom is on the horizon for Somalia, which could be a major game changer for the country. President Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud has announced that the country will start drilling its own oil in the coming months. Somalia has an estimated 30 billion barrels of offshore oil reserves, which remain untapped. However, President Mahmoud told lawmakers at the opening of the 7th session of the Federal Parliament in Mogadishu on Monday, September 29th,
in the past. In this context, we jointly announced today that significant progress has been achieved in the exploration of Somalia's offshore oil and gas resources. This was a long-awaited investment and exploration, which we are very much grateful for Turkey to become the pioneer of that field. Technically and scientific assessments conducted to date have confirmed positive results, marking an important milestone in Somalia's economic recovery and a long-term development and prosperity. This is a long-term investment, a long time-consuming effort in exploration, but so far the prospects are very positive and very encouraging. Based on these findings, preparations are now underway to proceed to the next phase of drilling operations. This is another huge undertaking and a task, but it will start soon, and Mali's maritime areas along the country's coastline. This is not an easy task. This investment,
one of the most difficult and frustrating places on the planet, and that is Africa, and specifically Eastern Africa. In recent years, violent conflicts in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia have destabilized the region. These conflicts.
For decades, Somalia was viewed primarily through the lens of conflict, humanitarian need, and piracy. Energy discussions rarely included the Horn of Africa, despite geological surveys quietly suggesting that Somalia sat atop one of the least explored hydrocarbon basins in the world. That perception changed dramatically when a wave of seismic studies, offshore drilling data, and revised reserve estimates converged around a staggering possibility. Somalia could be sitting on oil and gas resources valued at nearly $2 trillion. The figure did not emerge from a single announcement or discovery well. Instead, it reflected cumulative estimates from offshore basins stretching along Somalia's vast coastline, combined with onshore sedimentary formations long neglected due to insecurity. Energy analysts noted that Somalia's geology closely mirrors that of oil-rich regions across the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Peninsula, where proven reserves transformed national economies. What made the development seismic was not only the scale, but the timing. Global energy markets were already under strain from geopolitical conflicts, sanctions, and supply chain realignments. New producers entering the market at scale could alter pricing power, shipping routes, and strategic alliances. Somalia, once marginal in global calculations, suddenly became central. For the United States, the implications were complex. Washington had long viewed Somalia through a security-first framework, prioritizing counterterrorism and regional stability. Energy had never been the primary driver of policy. A potential Somali oil boom introduced a new variable, a resource-rich state outside traditional Western energy alliances, located near some of the world's most critical maritime choke points. American energy strategists understood that large-scale Somali production could influence global supply dynamics, particularly if Somalia aligned with non-Western partners for exploration, financing, and export infrastructure. Such an alignment could reduce Western leverage over emerging energy corridors in East Africa and the Red Sea. Israel's reaction was shaped by geography and energy strategy. Over the past decade, Eastern Mediterranean gas discoveries had reshaped regional energy politics, turning offshore fields into instruments of diplomacy and security. A major new hydrocarbon hub across the Red Sea introduced competition, but also strategic uncertainty. Control over nearby sea lanes, pipeline routes, and LNG shipping became even more sensitive. The Somali government framed the emerging discoveries cautiously. Officials emphasized that the estimates were projections, not proven reserves, and that commercial production would require years of investment, regulation, and stability. Still, the shift in tone was unmistakable. Somalia was no longer presenting itself merely as a recipient of aid, but as a future energy player. What amplified global attention was Somalia's insistence on sovereignty. New petroleum laws prioritized state control, transparent licensing, and revenue-sharing mechanisms with regional authorities. These frameworks were designed to avoid the resource curse that had plagued other states, while signaling to investors that Somalia intended to negotiate as an equal, not a desperate host. International oil companies took notice. Firms that had avoided Somalia for decades began reassessing risk models. Offshore exploration, insulated from many onshore security challenges, became especially attractive. Advances in deepwater drilling technology lowered barriers that once made Somali basins inaccessible. At the same time, Somalia's leadership diversified diplomatic outreach. Energy discussions expanded beyond traditional Western partners to include Asian, Middle Eastern, and African investors. This diversification unsettled established powers, who recognized that energy partnerships often translate into long-term political alignment. Regional dynamics added another layer. Neighboring states monitored the developments closely, aware that Somali oil exports could reshape East African energy markets. Ports, pipelines, and refineries suddenly carried regional significance. Somalia's coastline, already strategic, gained new importance as a potential energy gateway between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Environmental and social concerns also surfaced early. Somali civil society groups warned against repeating extractive mistakes seen elsewhere. They demanded environmental safeguards, community consultation, and transparent revenue management. These pressures influenced policy, reinforcing the government's emphasis on phased development rather than rapid exploitation. The $2 trillion valuation itself became a subject of debate. Energy economists cautioned that such figures represented gross and ground value, not net revenue. Prices fluctuate, extraction costs are high, and infrastructure remains limited. Yet even conservative adjustments left Somalia with reserves large enough to transform its fiscal future. This potential transformation triggered strategic recalculations in Washington. Analysts debated whether Somalia's energy emergence could weaken Western influence in the Red Sea region or create opportunities for partnership if handled carefully. Some argued for deeper engagement to ensure Somali development aligned with international norms. Others worried that heavy-handed involvement could backfire, pushing Somalia toward alternative alliances. In Israel, energy planners considered scenarios in which new suppliers altered regional gas markets, while Somali oil would not directly compete with Eastern Mediterranean gas. It could influence shipping routes and regional energy diplomacy. Control of maritime security in adjacent waters became an even higher priority. Somalia's internal politics also evolved. Federal and regional authorities negotiated revenue-sharing arrangements, aware that disputes could derail development. These negotiations were difficult, but they reflected a recognition that unity was essential to capitalize on the opportunity. The discovery narrative reshaped Somalia's global image. Media coverage shifted from conflict to potential. Investors began asking not whether Somalia could stabilize, but how quickly. This psychological shift alone carried economic value, influencing credit perceptions and diplomatic engagement. Yet risks remained significant. Infrastructure gaps, security threats, and governance capacity posed challenges. Somali officials acknowledged that oil alone would not solve systemic issues. They emphasized diversification, using potential energy revenue to fund education, agriculture, and renewable energy. Global energy markets reacted cautiously. Prices did not spike or crash, but futures analysts incorporated Somalia into long-term supply forecasts. The country's emergence reinforced a broader trend. Energy production was becoming more geographically distributed, reducing the dominance of traditional suppliers. For the United States and Israel, the shock was not fear of scarcity, but uncertainty. A new energy actor outside established frameworks always introduces unpredictability. Somalia's insistence on independent partnerships amplified that uncertainty. The broader geopolitical implication was clear. Energy discovery was no longer confined to politically aligned states. As technology expanded access to frontier basins, geopolitics followed geology, not ideology. Somalia's story thus became emblematic of a shifting global order. A state once marginalized by instability was now influencing conversations in major capitals. The $2 trillion figure, whether ultimately realized or revised, symbolized possibility rather than certainty. In the years ahead, Somalia's challenge will be translating potential into reality without sacrificing sovereignty or stability. For global powers, the challenge will be adapting to a world where new energy producers emerge on their own terms. What shook Washington and Jerusalem was not merely oil beneath Somali waters. It was the realization that geopolitical relevance can change faster than policy frameworks, and that the map of global energy is being redrawn. In unexpected places, Somalia did not announce a new era with speeches or spectacle. It emerged quietly, through data, geology, and law, yet the implications reverberated widely. In a world where energy still shapes power, Somalia's discovery marked a turning point, one that reminded global actors that the next strategic shift may already be underway, far from traditional centers of control. As attention intensified, Somalia's emerging energy profile began influencing diplomatic behavior in subtle but important ways. Meetings that once centered on security cooperation gradually expanded to include infrastructure financing, maritime logistics, and technical capacity building. Energy was not discussed in isolation, but as part of a broader development equation that could redefine Somalia's long-term trajectory. What made Somalia's case unique among emerging producers was the absence of entrenched extraction infrastructure. Unlike older oil states burdened by aging pipelines and inflexible contracts, Somalia had the rare advantage of starting almost from scratch. This allowed policymakers to study the mistakes of others and design regulatory frameworks informed by global best practices. Production sharing agreements, local content requirements, and sovereign oversight mechanisms were debated with unusual intensity for a country still rebuilding core institutions. This deliberate pace frustrated some investors seeking rapid returns, but it reassured others who valued stability over speed. Long-term energy projects require predictability, and Somalia's emphasis on legal clarity signaled seriousness. The government repeatedly stressed that any extraction must support national development rather than short-term fiscal relief. The offshore nature of most projected reserves further shaped planning. Deepwater drilling minimizes direct land displacement but raises environmental stakes. Any major spill could devastate fisheries and coastal livelihoods. This reality pushed environmental safeguards to the forefront of negotiations. Somalia's coastline is not only long but economically vital, supporting trade, fishing, and regional shipping. Protecting it became a strategic necessity rather than a symbolic gesture. International environmental groups and maritime insurers closely monitored policy drafts, aware that weak standards could discourage financing. Somalia's insistence on environmental assessments and emergency response planning reflected lessons learned from other frontier producers. As Somalia's energy narrative matured, regional competition quietly intensified. Neighboring states, some already energy producers, recalculated their own strategies. Port expansion projects gained urgency. Pipeline routes that once seemed speculative were reconsidered. The Horn of Africa began appearing in energy forecasts alongside West and North Africa, regions long dominant in continental production. This regional recalibration intersected with global power competition. Energy access remains a cornerstone of geopolitical influence. Countries that finance exploration often gain leverage through technology, training, and long-term service contracts. Somalia's refusal to rely on a single bloc complicated traditional influence models. For the United States, the dilemma was balancing engagement with restraint. Excessive pressure risked alienating Somali leadership and public opinion. Insufficient involvement risked ceding influence in a strategically vital region. Policy analysts debated whether energy cooperation should complement existing security partnerships or remain secondary. Israel's calculations were more indirect but no less significant. Stability in the Red Sea corridor is essential for maritime trade and energy transport. A resource-rich Somalia could either reinforce regional stability through development or become a new arena for competition if mismanaged. Monitoring developments became a priority, even as public commentary remained measured. Somalia's domestic discourse evolved as well. Public expectations rose quickly, sometimes unrealistically. Officials warned against assuming immediate wealth. They emphasized that oil revenues, even at scale, arrive slowly and fluctuate with global markets. Education campaigns highlighted the need to invest in human capital, not just physical infrastructure. The government also faced pressure to ensure equitable distribution. Somalia's federal structure required delicate negotiation between central and regional authorities. Revenue-sharing formulas were debated intensely, with the understanding that unresolved disputes could trigger instability. These discussions, though contentious, marked a departure from past exclusionary governance. Financial institutions watched cautiously. Credit rating agencies noted the potential upside but maintained conservative assessments due to political risk. Development banks explored blended financing models that could support energy infrastructure while funding social programs. Meanwhile, global energy markets continued to shift. Renewable energy expansion, climate commitments, and evolving demand patterns complicated long-term projections. Somalia's planners acknowledged that oil would not dominate forever. Gas development and potential renewable investments were integrated into national strategies to hedge against future transitions. This forward-looking approach resonated with younger policymakers and technocrats. They framed oil not as an end goal, but as a bridge toward broader industrialization, refineries, petrochemicals, and energy-intensive manufacturing were discussed as ways to capture more value domestically. The international media narrative also matured. Early headlines focused on shock and surprise. Later analysis emphasized process, governance, and feasibility. Somalia's emergence became a case study in how frontier states navigate sudden strategic relevance. Critics remained skeptical. Some argued that security challenges could derail progress. Others warned that geopolitical competition could distort decision-making. Somali officials acknowledged these risks openly, insisting that transparency was their primary defense. As years pass, the true scale of Somalia's reserves will become clearer through drilling results, not projections. Some estimates may be revised downward. Others could be confirmed. Regardless of final numbers, the psychological shift has already occurred. Somalia is now perceived as a potential contributor to global energy supply, not merely a recipient of external support. This perception alters bargaining power. It changes how Somalia is treated in negotiations, how investors assess risk, and how allies prioritize engagement. Even before the first barrel is produced, influence has shifted. For the United States and Israel, the lesson is not loss but adaptation. Global energy power is decentralizing. New producers emerge outside traditional alliances. Strategic relevance increasingly depends on flexibility rather than control. Somalia's discovery underscores a broader trend reshaping global geopolitics. Resources once considered inaccessible are becoming viable due to technology and changing risk appetites. Political stability, not just geology, determines who benefits. The conclusion is not one of inevitable confrontation or dominance. Somalia's energy future remains unwritten. It could foster development, regional cooperation, and stability. It could also exacerbate tensions if mishandled. What is certain is that Somalia is no longer invisible in strategic calculations. The $2 trillion estimate, debated and provisional, served as a catalyst. It forced global actors to reassess assumptions and recognize that power can emerge from unexpected places. In this sense, the shock felt in Washington and Jerusalem was less about oil volumes and more about timing. In a world already navigating energy transition and geopolitical fragmentation, Somalia's rise adds another variable. The story is still unfolding. Wells must be drilled, institutions strengthened, and agreements honored. But the moment has already passed when Somalia's potential could be ignored. The discovery did not end old challenges overnight. It did something more subtle and enduring. It repositioned Somalia from the margins of global strategy to the center of a conversation about the future of energy, sovereignty, and influence in a rapidly changing world.